Why does everyone hate kids? It honestly seems like birth rates in nations like Romania, Canada, and even Bangladesh are so low, humanity is heading towards extinction. Just for comparison, the Republic of Samsung, less commonly known as South Korea, will lose roughly 85% of its population by the end of the century. But is it really that important of a problem? The world is already facing a massive amount of problems, like a war in Ukraine, a cost of living crisis, a trade war, and even Kanye West's newest song. So is a low fertility rate really all that big of a problem? And as you can probably guess by the sarcastic tone in my voice, yes, it's actually the most important problem we are facing by a long shot. What if I told you that all the problems I listed, and many more, including the war, high house prices, and even the rise of far-right political parties, aren't actually problems, but instead just the side effects of living in a world with an actively shrinking population? Before you call me a crazy conspiracy theorist and lock me up in a mental institution, please hear me out. What was the best time to live in American history? Most of you likely answered from the 1960s to the 2000s. While life wasn't perfect back then, at least the average person could afford to have a family and buy a house on a single salary. And coincidentally, those years happened to perfectly align with the years the baby boomers, the largest generation ever in American history, happened to enter the workforce. Similarly, West Taiwan exploded economically during the 90s and 2000s, which happened to perfectly coincide with the largest Chinese generation entering the workforce. And this also works backwards. Japan, Germany, and Italy have one thing in common, and it is not what you are thinking of. I'm talking about their demographics. In the last 2 decades, all 3 of them saw a large share of their population enter retirement. And as you probably already know, the economies of those 3 nations have struggled immensely over the last 2 decades. And even someone like Putin, when asked what is the largest issue the Russian Federation is facing, he almost never answers the war in Ukraine or NATO or the failing Russian economy, and instead almost always he keeps emphasizing the importance for Russian families to have more kids. But like, why would a smaller population even be a problem? After all, wouldn't that mean that the standards of living increase for the rest of us? Less people to share your food and natural resources with, and most importantly, less people competing to buy houses, which would radically drop their prices. And if you happen to think like that, then congratulations, my dear friend, for having a similar understanding of economics as a kid, asking why can't we print more money to give to the poor? And that's because an actively shrinking population creates 3 major problems. And to better understand them, let's take an example. This is Island A, and this is Island B. The first one has a population of 100 people, and the second one has a population of 1,000 people. If that's the only thing you know about them, then which one is more likely to have a higher standard of living? Well, obviously the second one, because due to the higher population, economies of scale become easier to achieve. But now let's change the scenario. The first one has 100 people, but 10 of them are over the age of 75. And in the second one, out of the 1,000 people, 600 of them are over the age of 75. Which of the 2 is likely to be richer on a per capita basis now? And obviously it's the first one, because the ratio of retiree per worker is much better. In the real world, the issue nations like Thailand, Spain, Russia, and many more are facing is that there are way too many people that don't actively contribute to the economy. There exist many reasons someone might choose not to work. They might have a disability. They might be financially supported by their significant other. They might be too young to work, although that one doesn't apply for everyone. And by far and away, the most common reason is people are getting too old to work. Let's take the economic juggernaut of Greece, for example. To put in a nice way, the Greek economy over the last few decades has been a hot pile of garbage. And while most of the blame goes to their highly incompetent leaders, that thought falsifying economic data and taking out enormous amounts of debt was a good idea. We have to acknowledge that Greece also has some of the worst demographics in the Western world. For more than 45 years, the fertility rate has been below replacement levels, and the average age in the nation is fast approaching 50, which in practical terms means that a massive amount of the nation's resources goes towards supporting the older generations instead of improving the economy and repaying debt. Estimates vary depending on how you calculate the percentage, but it's safe to say 40 to 55% of the nation's tax revenue goes into funding healthcare, pensions, and other public services that predominantly benefit older individuals. In a desperate attempt at minimizing the negative effects of the low birth rate, Greece and many other Western nations have started importing millions upon millions of immigrants from third world countries. But unfortunately, this hasn't really worked out. In most cases, immigrants fail to assimilate into the society and they struggle to find well-paying jobs, which means that the economic benefits from them are much less than expected. And even worse, in many cases, they end up being a net negative on the system. Secondly, fertility rates in the third world have also crashed, which means that as time goes on, it will become harder and harder to import migrants because they simply won't exist anymore. For example, Bangladesh and India already have fertility rates much below replacement levels, and in the next few decades, both of them will start seeing catastrophic drops in their populations. But the largest issue with older generations generations outnumbering the young is that they dominate politics, and usually they get what they want. And what do old people want? Higher pensions, more free healthcare, and higher house prices, all things that are going to cripple the next generations. I mean, just look at 2008, Barack used taxpayer money, which comes predominantly from working-age people, to bail out irresponsible home owners, which overwhelmingly happened to belong to the older generations. Essentially, it was a massive wealth transfer from the young to the old. And just as expected, he overwhelmingly won the 2012 election. So, okay, now we understand the absolutely devastating implications of a low birth rate, and why it's the second worst thing to ever happen in history, only behind the death of Harambe in 2016. Let's also discuss why nobody is doing anything about it, and why would humans as a species collectively decide to commit genocide on themselves? The first part of this question is actually kind of easy to answer. Demographic changes take decades to show any significant effect on an economy. For example, Japan's and Eastern Europe's fertility rates collapsed in the 60s and 70s, while their economies started to struggle much later, specifically during the 90s and early 2000s. On the other hand, the next election cycle takes much less than 30 years, so why would any self-respecting politician bother himself with solving an actual important issue that will determine the future of his nation, instead of focusing on more important problems like how he can buy more yachts using public funds? But this still doesn't explain why. Why would we choose to eradicate ourselves? Just for reference, if China keeps its fertility rate stable, which is not likely because it keeps plummeting, and also their lifespans don't increase by any significant amount, by 2100, their population will fall to 380 million from the current 1.4 billion, and by 2200, there will be less than 30 million Chinese on planet Earth. And as I said, this is the best case scenario. If current trends continue, the population drop will be even more dramatic. But why? And in all honesty, we don't really know. None of our theories perfectly predict fertility rates, and even the ones that show weak correlation tend to have multiple extreme edge cases. For example, you might think that high house prices and the economic challenges that the world has been facing the last few decades play a massive role in lowering fertility rates because young people don't have the money to start a family. But if that was the case, why do the poorest nations have the highest birth rates and the richest have the lowest? Even worse, nations with mostly similar levels of GDP per capita have wildly different fertility rates. For example, India and Pakistan have for the most part quite a similar standard of living. But while India is slowly heading toward population collapse in the next few decades, Pakistan is experiencing a massive population boom and will likely double or even triple its population by the end of the century. Similarly, Hong Kong and France have comparable economies, but while France is doing somewhat of a great job at keeping its fertility rate at replacement levels, Hong Kong is likely to lose up to 80% of its native population by the end of the century. Other theories, like the rise of feminism, the popularization of dating apps, the increased use of technology in our daily lives, the rise in obesity rates, and urbanization, seem to have virtually no effect on birth rates. Which brings us to the million-dollar question: can governments increase fertility rates through pro-natalist policies? While the government forcing people to have more babies sounds like the plot of a 90s horror movie set in a technological dystopia, unfortunately, we might need to enforce some of those policies to make sure the entire welfare system doesn't collapse under its own weight. So has any nation ever successfully increased fertility rates? And the answer, unfortunately, isn't what you want to hear, and it's actually pretty fucked up. Giving people tax breaks or longer parental leave doesn't seem to have any significant long-lasting positive effects on fertility. But one man found out a way not to just increase fertility rates, but to also double them and keep them at that increased level for more than 2 decades. And obviously, I am talking about the communist dictator of Romania. In 1966, Romania was cooked. The birth rate had fallen off a cliff, and the government was desperate to find a solution before the economy started collapsing. Although, to be fair, it's not like it was doing great in the first place. So they implemented Decree 770. In basic English, it banned the use of contraceptives for women under the age of 45. It made abortion almost illegal, with only a few rare exceptions. It heavily taxed people that didn't have kids, and most importantly, women with 5 or more kids were treated as heroes in the nation and were given massive benefits by the government. While the policy was indeed successful in increasing the fertility rate and also propping up the Romanian economy, most people nowadays agree this was one of the worst disasters in Romanian history, mainly because those policies led to a massive increase in the number of orphans living in Romania during those years. Aside from this extreme and somewhat barbaric attempt at increasing birth rates, historically, there have been very few other times we've successfully bumped them up, which just shows how incredibly hard it will be to reverse this issue. But let's return to the main part of this video. Is humanity actually going extinct? Well, first off, we have to realize the global population went from 0 to 8 billion people in just the blink of an eye, and there is no reason to believe the opposite can't happen equally as fast. And yes, if you simply run the numbers, most nations in the world will go completely extinct in the next next 100 to 250 years. Although it's important to note that making predictions this far out into the future is quite unreliable and a really bad idea. Countless things could change how the future plays out, from new technologies offsetting lost productivity to the medical field radically increasing lifespans. But regardless, humanity as a species needs to prepare for the worst-case scenario, which is a future where the Earth is mostly empty, the median age on the planet is 85, and the global economy is constantly shrinking year after year. One of the worst affected nations by the falling populations is Greece. If you want to learn a little more about them, click here or just subscribe. Have a great rest of your day.